We are live, Corey. You've got the floor.
Okay, I don't see it streaming here though. Oh, there we go. It's just coming up now. All right, welcome everybody, and I hope you're all having a great day, and thank you for joining us. I'd love, which we've called Teaching Beyond January 6th. I'm Corey Wright-Maley, your moderator today, and Associate Professor of Education at St. Mary's University in Calgary, Canada, which is in Treaty 7 territory, the enduring lands of the Siksika, Sitapi, or Blackfoot peoples of the Siksika, Kainai, and Piikani nations, and home to the Iyahe, Nakota, and Tsuut'ina, who entered into Treaty 7 with the Government of Canada as free peoples and independent nations. This land is also considered to be the homeland of the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. So thank you to our sponsors today, Assert, the new social studies research journal for teachers, the NCSS, KUFA, and SS Chat on Twitter. And I'm honored to be introducing my esteemed colleagues here today. Dr. Judy Pace, professor in teacher education at the University of San Francisco, and she is the author of the soon-to-be available and available for pre-order of Hard Questions, Learning to Teach Controversial Issues. She'll be speaking today on the issue of teaching controversial issues in a time of crisis. Dr. Denisha Jones will follow her. She's director of the Art of Teaching program at Sarah Lawrence College in Bronxville, New York, co-editor of the newly published book, which I just got my copy of, Black Lives Matter at School, and also the most educated person I know with both PhD and a JD. She'll be speaking to the issue of helping young children make sense of difficult news. Dan Krutka, associate professor in the College of Teacher Education and Administration at the University of North Texas in Denton, Texas. Among his many interests are social media's place in democracy. And as our resident tech expert, he's going to be exploring the role of social media and disinformation. And Dr. Kristen Duncan will be next. She's assistant professor of social studies education at Clemson University in Clemson, South Carolina. Her recent research focuses on how Black teachers address race and racism in schools. And she'll be speaking to understanding the role of race in the insurrection. And then finally, Dr. Alex Cuenca, assistant professor of social studies education at Indiana University in Bloomington, Indiana. Some of his recent scholarship is dedicated to civic education in urban classrooms, and he'll be talking about resisting a return to normal following these events. So with that in mind, I would like to pass it over to Dr. Judy Pace. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Corey, and greetings, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for persisting through so many layers of crisis these last 10 months and these last 4 years. I'm going to share my screen so you can see some images while I'm talking. Let's see, Chrome tab over here. Yeah, here we go. All right. So our political crisis has shown a spotlight on the necessity of radically strengthening civic education. Within that agenda, teachers are now called on like never before to discuss controversial issues with their students, even younger children. So how do you all feel about doing that with everything else you have on your plates? Teacher educators, what are you doing to prepare novices to teach controversial issues in this political moment with so much else to do? The pandemic, racial oppression, including police abuse, environmental disasters, ongoing threats to democracy, and the violent attack on our Capitol, not to mention the Trump presidency, have fueled such intense controversy across the nation. In recent months, there have been fantastic webinars, guidance, and lesson plans offered by the sponsors of this event, as well as many other organizations. But we know many educators don't practice the teaching of controversy, and opportunities to discuss issues are unequally distributed. Black and brown students, newcomers, those from low-income families, and those in lower classes have less access than their more privileged peers, which has serious consequences for democracy. Understandably, many of us feel unprepared to take up this demanding practice. We just haven't learned what it involves or how to do it. And we teachers may feel loss of control, conflict in the classroom, harm to students, and recriminations from parents or administrators. So what can we do to make teaching controversial issues feel safer and more feasible for more teachers in this moment? How can we better prepare novices to do this brave and important work moving forward? So I'm going to talk about a study that I conducted on how 4 teacher educators in their methods courses prepare their pre-service teachers to teach controversial issues, and how pre-service teachers took up this practice in real classrooms located in political hotspots. With funding from the Spencer Foundation, I got to travel, and the cross-cultural insights were fascinating and I think really relevant to what we're dealing with today. 2 of the methods courses were in Northern Ireland, which is a divided society with a legacy of violent conflict known as the Troubles. And this is one of several peace walls that still separate Catholic and Protestant communities in Belfast. The other 2 teacher educators were located in England, still reeling from the Brexit vote, and the Midwestern US in a patchwork of red and blue communities. My research offers 2 big ideas that I think are especially helpful for teaching beyond January 6th. So here's big idea number 1, contained risk-taking. On one hand, the teacher educators I studied prepared novices to explore open questions related to current issues and contentious history using democratic pedagogies like inquiry and deliberation and provocative resources. But they also addressed the risks of teaching controversy through several core strategies that they taught their pre-service teachers and practiced themselves. I think these strategies are especially important in a time of crisis, when teachers and students don't want to feel more exposed or more vulnerable than they already do. So, cultivation of warm, supportive classroom environments, thorough preparation and planning, reflection on teacher identity and roles, proactive communication with parents, other teachers, and administrators, careful selection, timing, and framing of issues, emphasis on creative resources and group activities rather than whole group discussion, steering of discussion, and dealing with emotional conflicts. So let's look for a second at selection, timing, and framing of issues. We know that open issues should be taught through multiple perspectives as long as they are legitimate. But some topics that spark controversy shouldn't be framed as open. For example, we wouldn't treat the insurrection as an issue where different sides are given a fair hearing, or separation of families at the border. However, there are valid and important open questions like, should Twitter and Facebook continue to ban Trump? And what should US immigration policy be at this point? And issues that hit close to home should come later after your class has discussed issues that are less charged. So don't feel pressed to dive deeply into the events of January 6th until you've had time for you and your students to get ready. And finally, instead of opening up discussion by asking students what their opinions are, frame issues with inquiry questions that guide a structured learning process, such as, how is hate speech defined? And should the US have a hate speech law? Self-positioning can happen publicly or privately after students have examined different perspectives, perhaps using a human rights framework to evaluate them. Big idea number 2 is adapting pedagogical tools to specific teaching contexts. The pre-service teachers I studied selected and adapted pedagogical tools from their courses to fit their students, lessons, subjects, school placements, national politics, and their own teacher identities. One of the pre-service teachers I interviewed, Andrew, streamlined structured academic controversy on free speech versus censoring racist speech because citizenship classes at his school were only 35 minutes long. In contrast, Margaret had time to conduct an ambitious SAC on compensation of victims during the Troubles over a 2-day politics lesson with resource packets, primary sources from Northern Ireland's government, and student research. For teacher educators, here are suggestions from the pre-service teachers I studied about how best to support their practice. So model the best ways to teach controversial issues and show how you would address students' academic differences and emotional reactions. Get the class to dive deep into discussion of hot button issues themselves as educators. Provide opportunities for pre-service teachers to develop lessons and practice teach controversial issues and give them feedback. And schedule classes to convene during and after student teaching so student teachers can debrief their experiences with teaching controversy and get support. So thanks everybody. And as Corey said, I'm coming out with this new book February 15th. So here's the information. If you want to order, there's a discount code, RLFANDF30 to get a 30% discount. And that's it. So thank you. Now I need to figure out how to stop sharing my screen. Here we go. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Judy. I'm going to talk about a little bit about the same thing you did, but how do we frame this for even younger children, right, who can't have a conversation as deep with some of the questions you posed.
Dr. Jones, real quick, we're going to take a couple of questions and then we'll move right to you. Is that okay? I think we have one from Chris Hitchcock, who's helping to lead the chat for you, Judy. So let me make it so we can see you well here, and you can see on the screen here. Here's a comment that she added. Can you see the comment on the screen?
Yeah. Yes.
She said, I'm curious if the question formulation technique is something that could work well with difficult topics so students could develop and explore questions they find important.
I think that's a great idea. You know, I'm all for self-directed learning. I think giving students guidance about what is a good controversial issue to explore that does have legitimate multiple perspectives would be a great learning experience for them as well. So yeah, let me know how it goes.
If we have time for one more quick one, what do you think, Corey?
One more on YouTube here. Why are there so few teacher education programs that avoid the issue of academic freedom to protect and make better informed teachers?
Yeah, if I'm understanding that correctly, is that question about assuming that teachers do have academic freedom rather than addressing the realities of that? I'm not sure that I can answer that question about, you know, teacher education programs in general, but I think it's a really important issue for teacher education programs to take up and to be realistic with teachers who are obviously teaching in many, many different contexts. I've been in touch with Elizabeth Washington about how teachers in Florida are being told that they should not be teaching about the insurrection, shouldn't be teaching about the election even. So there's a lot going on in terms of lack of academic freedom for teachers. Very context specific though. So thanks for the question.
Okay, are we moving to Dr. Jones, Corey?
All right, thanks, guys. As I was saying before, I want to have a similar talk as Judy, but I want to frame it for really young children, right? Because some of the prompts she mentioned, right, we have to adjust those a little bit. So I also work for an organization called Defending the Early Years, and my colleagues there, Diane Levin and Nancy Carlson Page, have written extensively about how to help children during peace and conflict times, right, and how to really help them think about it. So we issued a statement and some guidelines, and I just kind of want to expand on those guidelines and then also bring in some of the research I'm doing on anti-racism in early childhood and how we can even push our notions of development even further to really understand how children make sense of some of these things as well, too. So the first point I want to make is that we can't remain silent when things like this happen for really young children. And I'm talking about, ages 5 to 8, and maybe even 4 to 8. Because a lot of times we want to assume that the children don't know what's happening, but they're hearing it from someone, right? When I was a kindergarten teacher and parents were like, oh, I don't talk to my kids about that stuff, and they come into school ready to talk about it, right? So whether you're having an explicit conversation at home or not, the children are hearing it. They're hearing it from other kids. They know it from somewhere, right? So, and silence, unfortunately, reinforces sometimes problematic beliefs that the kids might hold, right? Because no one's allowing them to talk about what they're experiencing. And so in their mind, if they don't hear about it, then they're just going to go with the way they're thinking. And sometimes that thought process they have needs to be flushed out with an adult who can take them through it. And we do want to protect the kids from exposure to a lot of news and TV without having an adult there to guide them through it. One of the things they're looking at is, the racial trauma that children can experience. And one aspect is when there are police murders of unarmed Black people and it plays on the news over, some children don't understand that it's being repeated, like the news story is being repeated. They think the action is happening multiple times, right? So we want to make sure that if they're going to consume news and hear these stories, they are with an adult in a space where they can talk about it and say, no, this story recently happened, and we're going to talk about why this has happened to this person as well too. And sometimes they just hear us talking about things. I was really fortunate to work with my colleague, Dr. Susan Lin, and her puppet, she's a ventriloquist, Audrey Duck, and we did a video together after the murder of George Floyd. And the way we framed it is that Audrey overheard me and Susan talking about the protest, and she wanted to know what's a protest, right? So it's a really good way that even though we weren't directly talking to Audrey, she could pick up on something, and she needed a safe space to talk to adults about that. And you can find that video on the Defending the Early Years website at dey.org. And so children need to know that you're going to be there to help them through that they can come and ask you questions about things that are happening. If they feel that you're going to say, oh, we don't talk about that here, the next time they have a question about something important, they're not going to feel safe to come to you. And we don't want them thinking that they can't bring those questions to you. With really young children, it's important that we just start with what the children know. We don't want to give them too much information. And I think parents of young children can speak to this when your kid asks you a question and you're like, how do I answer that? And you're like, well, what do you know about that, right? Because we don't know what they know. We want to give them the space, right? So if I was teaching kindergarten and I taught in DC, so it would have been, non-COVID time, it would have been very interesting to bring a kindergarten teacher the day after the insurrection, and I would have said, well, what did you guys hear happened yesterday at the Capitol? Let's just talk about what you heard, and let's write some of those words that you heard on the board and really have that open-ended conversation to find out what they know about and what they heard, and then what they're thinking about it, and what questions do they have about it is also really important. And then based on their age, you want to think about how much information do they really need, right? We went back and forth, my colleagues at Defending the Early Years, about how much information would you give children about what an insurrection is. Like, I'm not even sure that's the word that we would use. But, when I taught kindergarten, we talked about protests and as part of our democracy and our rights. And actually, we had a protest around our school. We walked and carried signs because they were going to eliminate the positions for the art teacher and the music teacher. And the kids thought, after learning about protests, well, can we have a protest, right? So we might want to talk about, okay, we've talked about protests before, but how are protests that we've talked about and we've had different than what you saw or heard about on the news, right? Because we want them to understand that protests are safe spaces for people to go and to speak and make their voices heard. And we don't want them afraid that this is what a protest is, right? And we want them to understand that this got out of hand by certain people who wanted to disrupt that protest, and maybe even introduce the words riot and a mob, right? And what happens when some people disrupt an event. I think that's really important for children to understand. And then just thinking about their development and how can you relate it to them, right? And so we relate things to young children by giving them examples, right? What happens if you're in the cafeteria and some students start having a food fight? Do you join into the food fight, or do you say, no, I'm not going to participate in that, right? We want them to understand in a way that they can get it and they can understand that kind of concept and what they might do if they're in the situation and something is happening that they don't want to be around. You want to answer their specific questions, but don't give too much information, right? Which I know it's hard for teachers to do sometimes, right? But we don't want to confuse them. We don't want them to then have more questions on top of the other questions, right? We want to answer that question very simply and then wait to see what the next question is coming from them as well. And then helping them process what happened through different developmental activities, right? A lot of children have a lot of social emotion anxiety right now because of COVID, right? And they miss their school and their teachers and their friends, and we want to help them process that. And so using play, which is a really good therapeutic tool for young children, and kind of playing with them and hearing how they play and how they talk about, and knowing that they might reenact, right, what they know about the insurrection through their play, because that is how they process the experience, right? We have kids who play, you know, in the dramatic play center, and they're playing house. They're enacting the roles of everyday families that's part of their life. And so this might be something that they play. And we've also seen that kids are playing COVID, right? Because that's a big deal that's happening right now as well too. Art is another way for young children to process their emotions, and they can draw and make collages and paint, and also writing out stories, or dictating the stories to adults to write for them about what happened and what they're thinking about as well too. We definitely want to look out for any signs of distress, right? That a child is not okay comprehending what happened. And it really depends on how they understand who was involved and what happened and why, right? So some children might have a different version depending on their lived reality and how they come to understand it. Again, the children of Washington, D.C. would have had a very different response to what happened, because that is where they live, as opposed to where I am right now, and the children in New York, right, who don't really have that connection to the Capitol as well too. So it'd be really important to just look for any signs. And again, it could be difficulty sleeping, aggression, withdrawal, changes in appetite, even issues going to the bathroom could happen, right? And around that time, they need a lot of reassurance as well too. And then we want to help children experience what it feels like to solve conflicts, right, without resulting to violence. So we want to reinforce that. What can you do if you're in a space and someone is making you not feel safe? How can you respond without returning to violence? And having those scenarios, whether they're puppet shows or conversations about how we solve conflicts and how we protect each other. And that is also really important, that they need to know the adults are going to be there to protect them. So this was just some of the general guidelines. But as I mentioned, I've been looking at this anti-racist early childhood framework and really thinking about because a lot of people think young children are too young to understand a lot of these concepts, but they're actually not, right? Young children are very observant about race and ethnicity, about beliefs and attitudes, what they hear people say. So it's really important that we give them the language that they need to have these conversations, that we explain to them that, you know, these things are happening, and this is called, you know, this wasn't a protest, this was a riot, right? This turned into a form of violence that we don't believe is a safe space for people. And we actually protect them best when we prepare them to have these conversations. The best thing about young children is that they have a fairness meter that we don't even have, right? They know when something's unfair, and they want to live in a world that is fair and safe. And it's our job to help them get there, right? So when you present something to them and set it up that it's unequal or unfair, they're going to call that out, and they're capable of exploring that and what that means, right? Is it okay that when some groups of people protest, they're treated differently than other groups of people who protest, right? That's a fairness issue that children can understand and can talk about. And if they understand that protesting is a right that all human beings have, then it's not okay to treat people differently, right? And we want to have those conversations. As mentioned, I do have a book out on Black Lives Matter at school, and there is a lot of work being done in the early childhood years. One of our New York City teachers, Lelania Garcia, is teaching these principles to very young children, and it makes sense to 5-year-olds to hear about diversity and globalism and empathy and loving engagement and restorative justice, right? And trans affirming and even queer affirming, right? They're getting the language to make sense of these really big topics in a way that just makes sense for little kids. Lelania rewrote the principles for language for young children, and it's very great and very helpful. So I think it's really important that we just don't shy away from thinking that children don't deserve to be in this space. They don't deserve to have this conversation. They don't understand what's going on, because that silence will unfortunately send a really bad message. And lastly, I'll leave you with a resource. A good friend of mine, they have created a site called Woke Kindergarten, and they make 60-second texts for young children. And so after the insurrection, they made a 60-second text called "Can You Spot the Difference?" And it was just side-by-side photos for children to kind of look at and see, what do you see in these photos, right? Looking at other protests and looking at the insurrection. And I felt that was a very developmentally appropriate activity for really young children who like to stare at pictures and look at differences and can talk about what they see. And again, it's just 1 minute, and it's a really great text to use. So I'll leave you with that resource, and also have you check out the guidelines that we had at Defending the Early Years.
Thank you, Denisha. Are there any questions that are on your mind? We have time for two, and of course, at the end of all the presentations, we'll take more questions as well. Denisha, Rachel asks, is it possible to post the guidelines?
Sure. How should I can put the link in the chat here. Will that then get to them?
Yeah, that should.
Yeah, you can put it in our private chat and we'll add it. And we could also potentially, here we go. Yeah, we'll add them in right here.
So there's the PDF, and then let me put you the chat to Key's Woke Kindergarten page as well too. The two resources that I shared. There you go. So if you want to share those out, it'd be great.
And Chris is passing on this question. Do you have any suggestions for handling adults who are uncomfortable with young children discussing upsetting events beyond the points you've already raised about how children can absolutely do this?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I wrote in a blog recently for Defending the Early Years that I think our rush to protect children is natural, but it also limits our ability to see them and who they are and what they're capable of. And I think we need to think of protection in a different way. We protect kids by preparing them to have these conversations and to process these feelings, and we do them a disservice to not to get it. Do you remember being a child and there was some big adult concept that you didn't understand and no one would tell you and you didn't know how to ask, right? Like imagine all the angst could have been solved if someone would have just sat you down and had that conversation with you, right? And so I think we really want to avoid that. And so I tell parents, like, you're really supporting your child and what it means to grow up and be a global citizen when they have these conversations at a young age and it doesn't come to a shock, right? Most of us grow up and we're shocked to learn a lot of things that we didn't learn when we were young children about our country, about our democracy, and about what it means to be a citizen in this country, right? And I think a lot of that could be addressed early on if we just gave students the language at a very young age. For some children, you're gonna have this conversation with them and they're gonna move on, right? They're not gonna think about it or dwell about it, and that's okay. And other students are gonna wanna come back to it another day and talk about it. So, I don't think you don't wanna, pound it in every day, let's have this talk, but you wanna give it to them and see what they do with that knowledge and see what they do with that information. And I don't know of a story or a case where too much knowledge for a young child was a bad thing. So just know that you're really setting them up and to prepare them to be successful.
I love that turn on us, thinking about us as children and the frustration that came with that. I think that's a really poignant observation. Okay, Dan, next up. Take it away. And your mic is currently muted, just so you're aware there. It looks like Dan may have frozen here. Oh, and he's back.
Me okay?
Try again.
Hey, I'm having some tech problems, Corey. Let me fix those. Can we go to the next presentation? Can we go to Dr. Duncan and then come back to me?
Absolutely. Dr. Kristen Duncan, take it away.
All right. Good evening or good afternoon, depending on where you are. I'm going to talk about the role of race in the insurrection. So how did we get here? That's the question millions of Americans found themselves asking on January 6th as insurgents stormed the Capitol building. While there certainly is more than one answer to this question, it is painstakingly clear that one of the answers to this is race. Race has a whole lot to do with how we got here. This doesn't begin on January 6th. It begins far sooner, but because I don't have hours to talk to you, I'll start in 2008 with the election of Barack Obama. Those of us who study history know that anytime there is Black progress in the United States, it's followed by white resistance. So Barack Obama's election as president of the United States was sure to be followed by white resistance. It came in the form of loud dog whistles and some outright screaming. One example of this would be Tea Party caucus members who took full advantage of their constituents' virulent racism, refusing to even acknowledge that Tea Party activists had spat on and yelled racial epithets at Black Congress members, including the late John Lewis. A few years later, a reality television star began to question the citizenship of our nation's first Black president, once again feeding off the racism of potential voters. I think you know how the rest of this story goes. Fast forward to the summer of 2020. This summer, as peaceful Black Lives Matter protests took place all over the nation, nearly 4,000 National Guard troops were sent to Washington, D.C. to protect federal property. I say property because I'm sure you've seen the photos of dozens of National Guard troops in front of the Lincoln Memorial. There were no people there to protect. Because racism connects Blackness with violence, it did not matter that the crowd of peaceful protesters was racially diverse. What mattered is that they were marching and demanding racial equity for Black lives, which automatically associated the crowd with violence. This, in turn, is how we get federal troops called in from as far as Wyoming and Utah to protect federal monuments from peaceful protesters. Now, to January 6th. Fast forward a few months, and we learn that white supremacist insurrectionists have been openly planning to engage in violence at the U.S. Capitol. Yet, when they arrived on the afternoon of January 6th, they were not only were they not met with thousands of National Guard troops, spoiler alert, there were no National Guard troops, but some of them were embraced by Capitol Police who moved the barricades out of the way for them to enter the grounds of the Capitol. What would have happened if Black protesters had decided to storm the Capitol? I shudder at the thought. If the two side-by-side images of DC during the Black Lives Matter protest and the photos of police officers taking selfies with insurrectionists were not enough to explain the racial disparities in policing and the criminal justice system, we see them continue as one of the few Black men involved in the insurrection was denied bail, while the white woman who allegedly stole Nancy Pelosi's laptop and attempted to sell it to Russia has been sent home under the care of her mother. We know how we got here, but what do we do now? How should teachers guide students through understanding this? Teachers can help by helping students understand that democracy is a group project. While some may think that racial disparities in policing don't affect them, the insurrection at the Capitol is proof that such inequities harm all of us. In this instance, the racial disparities in policing almost cost us democracy itself. It is well understood that Black parents have to give their children a talk about the role of race, policing, and the criminal justice system. I've written about Black teachers giving the talk to Black students, but white students need to know about these issues too. Teachers can help students examine how Black communities are over-policed by looking at the numbers of drug arrests and comparing that data, drug arrests by race, and comparing that data to surveys about drug use. Teachers can also use images to help students understand the role of race in policing, similar to what Dr. Jones was just saying. The images during the BLM protest and the Capitol are useful, but you can also show students photos of police lined up in riot gear before a verdict or an indictment or even a lack thereof is announced. What does it tell us when police show up to a peaceful place in riot gear? As I noted earlier, democracy is a group project. As teachers, we need to help our students see that issues of race do not only affect people of color, they present a detriment to all of us.
Thank you, Dr. Duncan. Does anyone have a question for Dr. Duncan before we try to return to Dr. Krutka?
You've been quoted. You can see Dr. Duncan here. Here's Rochelle. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly with a comment. And then another person wanted to say the same thing and was mad that they got beat to it.
Oh, well, thank you.
Yeah. And Andrew Swan asks, so what more can we say as well as democracy as a group project to prevent them from opting out of that project?
I think it's important that we help them understand that you can't opt out of it, right? Like, unless, well, the way the US works, I mean, if you're in the United States, then things that happen to other people ultimately affect you on some level. So we need to help students understand that interconnectedness between all of us. So maybe if we even talked about, I don't know, budgets or something, if police are spending X amount of time in this area over policing people, then that means things over here might be getting ignored, right? So maybe you aren't getting what you need because other people are being over policed. Yeah, I think it takes a lot of understanding ourselves first, right? Like, teachers need to know how these things affect us before we can teach other folks about that. Oh, Dean, oh no. Yeah. We really have to help. I'm sorry, I'm talking in circles. One of the things that we don't do well, I think, is teaching what democracy is. So a lot of students really think democracy is just the tyranny of the majority. But that's not what democracy is, right? Democracy is about collaboration and cooperation and interconnectedness. So once we help students understand that that is what democracy is, then that is the first step in helping them see how what happens to other people affects them as well.
Kristen, can I just share? I wrote my syllabus and I said, you got to do a group project. I said, you can do anything you want except work alone. So yes, like, to somebody's question, are we saying you can't opt out because we don't live on an island? We live in a society with other people. And
Right.
no, it's a group project that you're born into, and that's just, the way it is. And I think if we really drive that home, that this is how we live together, they'll get it.
I like that.
Yeah, that's very good. All right. All right, Dr. Krutka, are you ready to give it another go?
I think I'm ready. I appreciate your patience, and thank you, Dr. Duncan, for jumping in there. My internet went out. I'm now on my neighbor's internet and in my kitchen, so I could access it. So every technology sometimes will go wrong. I'm going to add some slides here. Let me go ahead and make these full screen. Okay. So I'm going to talk about social media, disinformation, and radicalization. Again, my name is Dan Krutka. I'm from the University of North Texas. And I want to talk about these issues as they relate to January 6th insurrection and what we can do as social studies educators. So first, I want to point out that the January 6th insurrection is certainly a culmination of many intersecting phenomena, such as white supremacy, which is not new, conspiracy theories, which are not new, and social media, which is fairly new. And unfortunately, these problems do not operate on the fringes of society anymore, but actually in the halls of Congress, as exhibited by members like Georgia Rep. Marjorie Taylor Greene, who was elected after calling for the executions of Democrats, harassing a Parkland shooting survivor, and pushing Islamophobic and anti-Semitic conspiracies. She was recently appointed, if you didn't see, by the Republican Party to the House Education Committee. So I'm going to primarily focus on the role of social media and how teachers can address it by arguing that we really need three things: media education, media inquiry, and media activism. Here we go. Sorry, there we go. So many educators have responded to the proliferation of conspiracy theories like QAnon and associated white supremacy ideologies by calling for more media literacy. Media literacy has historically focused primarily on evaluating messages and trying to answer questions like those posed by the Stanford History Education Group in their civic online reasoning curriculum. And those questions are: who's behind the information? What's the evidence? And what do other sources say? So in other words, they're asking you to, do your research. And this is a good start. However, it does have its limits. If you're familiar with QAnon conspiracy theory community, you would know that one of the themes of their members is do your research. And the problem is that many of their members do not adhere to media literacy tenets. A recent New York Times expose, which you can see linked down here, explained that in QAnon member conversations, the most commonly used phrase is some version of "I heard" followed by a theory. So, for example, I heard that the Parkland shooting was a hoax. Unfortunately, for a conspiracy theorist, it is easy to rationalize answers to the free civic online reasoning questions, especially since part of the group identity is often formed around rejecting mainstream media sources. So when conspiracy theorists do their research, they're really searching for information that confirms their biases or their worldview. So one of our goals thus needs to be preventing students from being sucked into a rabbit hole of radicalization online. Just this week, Teaching Tolerance held an excellent webinar on combating online youth radicalization, which you can go find on their website. And they defined radicalization as views where one group is being blamed for larger social problems. And they encourage educators not to dismiss or berate students who espouse extremist beliefs, as these approaches can actually often backfire. I'll also add that educators should be very wary about giving conspiracy theories too much oxygen in the classroom. And Teaching Tolerance has encouraged educators to ask questions that help students develop critical thinking skills. And I recommend watching their full webinar to understand kind of their approach to it. I think the psychosocial approach to media literacy in the Unpacking Fake News book edited by Wayne Journell does a really nice job of encouraging educators to help students examine their own media consumption habits instead of just using general media literacy rules or questions. For many adolescents, information kind of bubbles up to them and they're more susceptible to outrageous or simple claims that confirm their biases. Ellen Middow has a great chapter that argues that youth need to practice with evaluating what she calls incidental media, and those are the posts that come up in their feeds, and how those are shaping their understanding of public issues. Michael Caulfield's SIFT method is also very useful. It's a 4-move approach that teachers can use to help students make really quick judgments about what they see on their feed and whether they should interact with it. In addition to helping students develop media literacy skills for what they see on their screen, social studies educators also need to educate students about what's happening behind the screens. Students need to understand how social media algorithms work, how social media companies make profits, and how social media impacts the way they think. Students should understand that, for example, YouTube is designed to maximize time on their platform. Therefore, they will feed people whatever will accomplish that goal. And unfortunately, humans are drawn to drama, outrage, and fear. And thus, if there's a young person searches for climate change, YouTube's algorithms will often recommend conspiracy theory videos that play on their emotions. Can you imagine if a young person asked a librarian for a book on climate change and the librarian recommended conspiracy theories that foretold that the earth is flat? The medium where we get information really does matter. 70% of videos people watch on YouTube are recommended by their algorithms, not chosen by people. YouTube, Facebook, and other social media platforms are not neutral conveyors of information. Instead, they are for-profit companies who have a financial incentive oftentimes to make the world worse. Capitalism often amplifies racism. Therefore, we need media activism. Unfortunately, we can't media literacy our way out of the online amplification of conspiracy theories and white supremacy. Instead, we need to pressure companies and legislatures to demand algorithmic and platform justice. In previous eras, television had the Fairness Doctrine and political ads had McCain-Feingold. And so there's not easy answers to creating a more just media ecosystem, but we need to investigate the possibilities and pursue reasonable regulation. Instead of asking students to write a letter to their congressperson who might be a conspiracy theorist or insurrectionist themselves, I recommend that teachers encourage students to investigate organizations that are fighting for more just digital laws. For example, organizations like the Algorithmic Justice League and Data for Black Lives are already leading the way in identifying techno problems and advocating for anti-racist solutions. In review, social studies educators should both teach general media literacy lessons and personalized lessons where students explore their own media habits. Civic online reasoning, the Unpacking Fake News book, and the SIFT method all can help. And students should also inquire into how the mediums work so they understand why something shows up in their feed and who benefits from it. And then finally, students and educators should seek out organizations advocating for more just online spaces and figure out how they can help. I did publish a 2020 article in Social Education that addresses many of these ideas, and I'll add it in the description along with the link to this full text and all the links to references for what I talked about. And so I'll conclude with a quote from a recent editorial I wrote with my co-editors at the Site Journal, Marie Heath and Lance Mason. We wrote that technologies are not neutral and neither are the societies to which they're introduced. And so we shouldn't need an insurrection to see the ways social media, conspiracy theories, and white supremacy intersect and pose a dangerous threat to our democracy. But if we hadn't seen it before, it's time we open our eyes and start working alongside students for a more just online world. Thanks.
Thank you, Dan. And bringing us home is Alex Cuenca. So take it away, Dr. Cuenca.
Are we going to take questions?
Oh, yes, we will take, yes, that's right. We will take a question. One of the questions is incidental media things people come across when they aren't looking for it?
Yeah, that's the way Ellen Middow describes it. If you've never come across her work, Ellen Middow is an incredible social media youth researcher. And yeah, basically what she talks about is, you know, the SHEG stuff is really good. I think it's part of our overall plan. But the problem is those lessons don't always translate to our immediate experiences, right? Because so much of your emotion is kind of tied up in how you read social media and how you confront it in the moment. And so she really recommends like actually pulling up feeds and having students do different types of things, whether it's a diary or it's whether than pulling up their feeds in class and talking about what information are you coming across. And so basically she just says incidental media is the stuff that pops up on your feed, and doing that kind of activity in class can allow students to think about it. Hopefully that answered your question, Chris.
Great. And can you clarify SHEG for those who don't know?
Yeah, SHEG is the Stanford History Education Group, and they have a civic online reasoning site that has a lot of really great activities. For example, they have one on Wikipedia. You often get kids who come in and they say, you can't use Wikipedia, it's not a credible source. And SHEG does a good job in their civic online reasoning of helping think through the complexity of it, because they have an activity where you go look at a page and you realize it's actually partially locked, it has a ton of sources. And so it makes it a little bit more complex, that we can't say simple statements like, this is a bad source, when we actually need to dig a little bit deeper.
And the second question before we move on to Dr. Cuenca, I guess it's a statement. Dan would probably say media literacy should be more pervasive across multiple courses, but what if the teacher does it badly? Then what?
Yeah, well, that's the problem of teaching, right? Anything we do badly isn't going to have a great effect. I mean, I think it's a really important point. And I think we have to think, what is media literacy for education? I actually don't even know if literacy is the right metaphor. I've been thinking about that a lot. That's why I actually use the term media education, because literacy kind of always implied, to me, its roots are rooted in actually analyzing text. And actually what you're doing online is very different. It's actually a very immersive experience, something more akin to watching TV, which you don't do the same thing. So that's a whole nother discussion. But I agree that media literacy is so needed.
All right, thank you. And sorry for nearly cutting you off without the questions.
All right. Well, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I'm really kind of pleased to be here. I'm glad being in the company of esteemed colleagues. It's always really, really fascinating. I think I've learned a lot tonight. My at least a little spiel here is going to be focused, perhaps not so much on technical aspects of teaching, but hopefully a provocation as we move forward. When I was thinking about the insurrection, I was thinking about kind of how to frame the event itself. And what I kind of started reflecting on was my own experience across the last 4 years. I don't know about all of you, but the last 4 years have really kind of at least rocked the cautiously skeptical faith I used to have in evangelizing democracy through my social studies teacher ed classrooms. It was something that at least I had a little bit of skeptical faith around in terms of what we could be as a country of citizens. And those were sullied a lot and kind of caused a lot of consternation for me as I kind of stood in front of a group of future teachers talking about the mechanics of discussions or the mechanics of controversial issues. And so even concepts that were familiar to me from even a Reconstructionist lens, like critical inquiry or cross-cutting discussions, they felt a little bit less worthwhile for me. And that was because we had an administration that welcomed and sanctioned the worst impulses of humanity. An administration that was openly jabbing at like the festering wounds of xenophobia, racism, misogyny that kind of formed in our body politic. In essence, what we saw crescendo, I think, on January 6th. And I don't think it was the only one. What we did, or at least what I did for 4 years, was struggle. I struggled to find words. I struggled to not let shock or anger show. And I struggled to try to find symmetry in the ways in which I knew, or at least I assumed, a democracy was engaged in rational discussions or conversations or a kind of a back and forth, even upon disagreement. That wasn't something I was ever kind of able to kind of grasp for the last 4 years. I think, in effect, what happened for us, at least for me, it's the health term is electroshock therapy, or what Naomi Klein has termed the shock doctrine. And she references this notion of shock therapy, which at its core seeks to return troubled patients to a blank slate where then the therapist could kind of write a new personality. And if I go back 4 years, I think of news cycle after news cycle after news cycle, and it was a form of shock therapy, a travel ban, kids in cages, Charlottesville, Ukraine, the expanding loss of environmental protections. And so I think perhaps the relief that many saw in January 20th and the hope was this notion of a return to normal. And it's something that I've seen in a lot of kind of media pieces as I've been kind of looking at the ways in which we're making sense of the new Biden administration. We're looking at, that Twitter is normal. The inauguration speech was normal. The policy ways in which we're thinking about now issues like the minimum wage seem like they're returning back to that symmetrical should we or shouldn't we position. And I guess as I'm both relieved by that, in a sense, it's a little bit scary because it shouldn't. Normal was never really normal to begin with. I think what we saw, what we're beginning to assume is normal, is the absence of the open visibility of those really insidious things that we experienced over the last 4 years. The sins of racism, the sins of xenophobia, the sins of misogyny that were kind of grotesquely in front of us on our screens as we were reading, as we were engaging in conversations with colleagues, as we were trying to stutter in front of our students to make sense of what to say about something like Charlottesville that was openly racist. The absence of those things doesn't mean that it's normal. I think, as my colleagues have already kind of mentioned, white supremacy has been white supremacy. It's just, this is the latest manifestation of that. And so we can't be shocked, or at least, shocked into thinking that those were just historical aberrations, that what we're going to want to do post January 20th, or at least post January 6th, is to put those things into a box and be kind of have amnesia about it. We know better. We know, looking at the students as history, as Dr. Duncan mentioned, we've been students of history. We know that there is something kind of, creeping up. And so the opportunity I hope that we find in this moment, and again, it's a provocation at least for you to think about, isn't that we embrace, no pun intended, the white noise of white supremacy. That we don't embrace the normal wavelength that we were used to maybe 4, 8, 12 years ago, however long you've been teaching in the classroom, where we package racism and xenophobia and misogyny in the narratives and the progress narratives that we say in our social studies classrooms, or in the ways in which we give kind of equal positions to positions on immigration. We've seen its ugly face. We've seen its most ugly face, I would assume, And that's something that requires us to not opt out of the conversation, that it's been outed in the open. And so we don't need to return to a normal position where xenophobia is positioned again as immigration policy amongst two equal positions, but that we actually call those things out as they are, and that we locate those places, and that we say those things. I don't want to return to a position, or at least implore all the educators there and all the teacher educators out there to not return to a normal where white supremacy isn't called out or identified. We've become too comfortable with that, and this is, in a sense, what we've been to and where we're going to go to. If we choose not to move, or we choose to forget, I'm sorry, where we need to be able to openly say that that is racist, that that isn't a political take per se, but that that is an actual fact. That radicalization, as Dr. Krutka mentioned, is radicalization. And that's something that needs to be identified and sussed out and explored and engaged with. So I hope that at least our response is not, again, to sit in the balm of normalcy. I ask that we're not lulled into a sense of normal discussions or conversations, that we don't see the remedy to hyperpolarization as hyperpragmatism, that the calls to unity are both unifying, but that part of that unification is also an identification of the problems that we are kind of very full aware of. And I hope that we have the boldness as we kind of step forward in a post-January 6th, post-January 20th world to call out the anti-democratic impulses through our curriculum, through our classrooms, through our engagements with students in our curriculum. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Cuenca. Are there any questions?
Here's a comment from Andrew that I think maybe is worth responding to here.
Yeah, absolutely. I do believe, and I do find, actually, I love, Andrew, that you mentioned journalism in this as well, because that's something I think about a lot too, is that we tend to kind of position again, ideas along the same lines. There were a lot of folks who quietly supported the insurrection through their policies, through their actions. And we've spent a lot of time in our classrooms trying to rationalize that and place those in symmetrical relationship with each other. And I think at least what's become clear to me is that those aren't really symmetrical positions anymore. That there are asymmetrical positions, that there's a group of individuals, it's a group of policy positions that are seeking to expand humanity. And there are a group of policy positions that are seeking to contract humanity. And so the way that I've at least reconciled when I'm speaking is to think about the most humane position. Which position am I going to take that's going to expand my students' version of humanity, my students' understanding of humanity? Because if I think about it at a human level, it almost extracts the political version out of it. I don't have to think about right or left or red or blue. I've got to think about human and what's the most humane position for us to take. And that's the one that I want to forward and advance to my students. And that's the one that I at least am trying to think about for my prospective teachers. How do we ask them to think about the most humane position forward?
Thank you for that. We have one last one here before we go to questions for the whole panel. What's your view of calling out versus calling in? I'm in a red state.
Yeah, I don't, I think I always err on the side of the judgment of the educator. The educator understands the political context and the space in which they engage and how they engage that conversation. And I know that sometimes what I might be saying sounds a little shrill only because I'm unaware of your own context in which you're teaching. And so I don't want it to come off as shrill. I want it to come off as kind of loving and caring in a sense. There has to be some position where you understand the relationship with your students to be able to call them in. But there also has to be some identification of what the problem is. And so I think relationally as educators, I think we're always calling our students in, especially when they're making mistakes, especially when they're saying things that are out of turn. It's an education, of course. But I would also say that there has to be some identification of why that's a problem for our collective good, kind of what Dr. Jones was saying. The democracy is a group project, right? So if there is something that is painfully hurtful, painfully problematic, that you are engaging in knowingly, unknowingly, learning, unlearned, that has to be at least identified for the individual while doing the loving calling in. I do find that, again, teaching is a pedagogical relationship, teaching is a loving and caring relationship. So there has to be that ensconced in the idea of naming white supremacy in our curriculum.
Great, thank you. Jessica Berneman has asked a question that I actually think is appropriate for the panel as a whole. I'm curious how any of you would explain to students the difference between January 6th and the riots that occurred in the summer.
I'll start, if that's okay with everybody.
Mm-hmm.
First, there's a lot of confusion about riots happening in the summer, right? So the overwhelming majority of protesting this summer was peaceful. What we also know is that there are some folks who thrive on instability, and so they use that as an opportunity to destroy property or incite violence wherever they were. But for the most part, people this summer, one, were primarily peaceful, but also they were protesting mistreatment, right? They're protesting the racial disparity in Black people dying at the hands of police. That is based in fact. The insurrection that happened on June 6th was rooted in fiction, right? It was rooted in this idea of Donald Trump being, having an election stolen from him. There's no proof that any of that happened. So that's where I'd start, right? So people who are largely peaceful, primarily peaceful this summer were protesting because of something that is rooted in fact, whereas the insurrection came from something that was completely fictitious. That would be my very, the foundation for where I started.
And can I add, I think after Kristen is starting there, is also look at the response, right? I think the person might be asking about Seattle, right? I remember Seattle, right, I think, or Portland, right? The ongoing protests. But look at the violent response their government gave to those people, right? They weren't free to just be on the street and protest every day. They got met with armored people and people coming at them in that way. So, and then look what happened on the Capitol of Washington, D.C. and the response, right, to that, to Capitol Police running away or to keep them from going after them or from letting them in, right, and giving them tours earlier in the day. I mean, those are the differences that I would really want to focus on too, because I've been to dozens of protests in D.C. and other places. And, if the police showed up in riot gear, I'm pretty sure it wouldn't be a protest, right? But normally the police are there, they're just hanging out, they're looking for anybody to cause trouble, and they're not in full riot gear. And so I feel very safe. But what we saw in the summer in those protests, it's the response that you get to your enactment of your civil rights that then cause it to turn from a protest to something else. And that did not get the same response at the Capitol during the insurrection.
Here's another question, if this one's okay, Corey, that Beth posted a little bit ago. So I wanted to get it in here before I lost it. She said, Dr. Jones mentioned very young children's fairness meter and the need for safety as developmental milestones to consider. Have people identified others that should shape these discussions for older kids?
I think the developmental framework for older children also says that they think about fairness. I think the difference is they shift in recognizing that we have this concept of fairness, but the older you get, the more unfair life is. and they kind of get that. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, Beth, right? But I think they still have these notions, but they're able to explore more abstractly as they get older, right? So it's not so much fairness happening to me right now, but thinking about fairness in a situation that they weren't a part of, like fairness in the past and fairness in history. And children can grapple with those conversations too, or recognize how we talk about fairness, but we don't enact it, right? And so they're able to think about that as they keep getting older as well.
I can jump in for a second.
Go
ahead, Dan. Oh, I was just going to say that sorry.
Yeah,
Judy, why don't you go ahead?
I think older students can, think more analytically and more abstractly and use frameworks like human rights, the UNDHR, to analyze different points of view, to, deliberate on what's fair and what's not fair, and even talk about the tensions among different rights as they play out in specific scenarios. So intellectually, they're ready to do that.
My comment was just very brief and actually follows very nicely on what Dr. Pace was saying. I think one thing for me as a white, educator that I've had to learn over time is to speak with moral clarity and work on defining issues like justice in the classroom, right? I think as I've made that more the forefront of my curriculum, like what is justice, and focused on the perspectives of groups that are historically marginalized, especially in history. For example, in my elementary social studies methods class, we read a book about Ona Judge's life, right? And so what does it mean to understand the founding of the United States from the perspective of a Black woman who was enslaved by George Washington? It changes your understanding of where this country started. And right, that's of course the debates and the around the 1619 Project too, and the reason for coming forward. So for me, speaking with clarity around justice is actually less of a partisan issue also, by the way. And it's something that I've found that has been helpful to me.
All right. Next question we have here is from Megan McDermott. Do you have any thoughts on how to help new teachers navigate the challenge of processing current events themselves while also helping students process those events simultaneously?
I'll jump in here. I mean, I think it's critical that you do it first yourself, right? I think that's one of the things that I like to, always tell my pre-service teachers is certainly like when something hits you, and again, we've had 4 years of things hitting us almost constantly. You have to sit and stop and think, and then think about ways in which there are particular aims to the conversation and the ways in which you're going to process. I think the biggest mistakes that teachers make is that they try to process it in real time with their students, and that never ends up well because it doesn't have a particular educational aim. Ultimately, we're educators. We're there to kind of at least, guide the educational thinking of our students and the social development of our students. And so we have to have at least some particular aim as we engage in those conversations. And so you've got the wealth of the social studies curriculum. What I often tell my students is that they have the wealth of the social studies curriculum. They have the wealth of all of the mechanics of the human experience that they can draw upon. So there's usually some kind of connection, some kind of way in which, not that they necessarily have to draw it back to page 77 of the textbook, but that they have to draw it to some particular educational aim to then engage in the conversation. And so if we're looking at kind of obviously purely racist or white supremacist acts, are there ways in which we can contextualize these events, have conversations, think about them, think about their through lines, think about the ways in which power, oppression, agency, all of those kind of big topics and themes work. Usually our current event has some kind of kernel in connection when we think about social studies broadly, not just as history, but as econ and geography and political science. So there are always places for us to kind of pluck from, but the question is we both have to first process our feelings first about it, process the ways in which we want to kind of frame that and contextualize it for our students, and then engage in those conversations. And as Dr. Jones mentioned, ask students where they are, what they know, and kind of play back and forth with that.
I think too, if I can take the liberty to jump in, is, my first year of teaching, 2 weeks in, September 11th happened, and, it was on every TV and every classroom. And I think Alex is right. If you start trying to analyze it for them in real time, and you're trying to make sense in this fog of war kind of situation, then you really aren't doing a service to your students. But one of the things that we don't do enough of is help students process emotions and allow them to feel those emotions and acknowledge those. And in those moments, I think that we can be there, not as counselors, we're not trained to be that, but to let our students share what they're processing in the moment, even while we're not doing that work in front of them.
I just want to add, really to kind of piggyback off what Alex just said earlier. As a new teacher specifically, come in with a plan, right? Like the idea of I'm going to walk in and talk about insurrection today and I haven't planned squat, it's probably not going to go the way you think it's going to go. So come up with a structured plan. And it might not go exactly as you planned, but that happens with lots of our lesson plans. At least you have some kind of guide to keep things within whatever bounds you want them to stay.
Speaking of the bounds in which these come into play, I think we've got time for one more question, which is kind of a hard-hitting one. How can we inspire students to bring these concepts home and become teachers to their parents or family members while they're still learning day by day? And maybe the underlying question here is that we are expecting them to do that, and should we be expecting them to do that?
I think kids naturally do that, right? Sometimes, right? They hear something at school and they kind of come home, and not when you ask them, what did you do in school? That's not when they tend to answer that question, right? But at other times they try and do that. And I think it's how the parent responds, right? To their saying that, because sometimes parents don't want their children giving them information they don't have, right? And they feel like the child is out of place a little bit. So I had a friend, a guy from El Salvador, and he really struggled because his son would always correct his grammar because he didn't, he's just learning English. And I said, no, but you got to let him do it. This is why he's going to be a great English speaker, because he can pick up the nuances between what you're saying and what he's learning in school. And so he just really needed to be comforted to not be surprised that his son was teaching him, right? And actually turned it into a teachable moment. He's, son, tell me how to say this because you know it better than I do. And so I think it's the same thing, that children want to share these things, but if their parents and their family are not going to open it up, they're not going to let them have that conversation. If they're in school and they want to come home and say, oh, we talked about, Black Lives Matter today, and their parents would say something like all lives matter, right? That's going to really cause the kids to shut down. But I think when parents hear the kids saying it, they're like, I don't know what to say. And it's the same thing about anything. You just ask them, oh, well, what does Black Lives Matter mean to you? Why do you think that's an important thing to know and understand? And they'll tell you why. And then, they'll know that they can come to you with these conversations. And even if you might disagree, I think it's really important. I would always tell my students, I said, yeah, your parents are going to have what they believe, what happens in your house, but I have to tell you what's going to happen in this classroom and in how we're going to live as a community. And that might change when you go somewhere else, right? And that's okay to kind of go back and forth, and people disagree on some things, but this is the conversation we're having. And I think just having that space, right, where kids don't feel that they can't voice something that's different, or that you're not willing to listen or learn from them, I think will really help them really understand why diverse views do exist in a democracy.
Thank you, Dr. Jones. It's already coming to the end of our night. This has been a wonderful panel and really engaged audience. It's been really great to have you, and I want to thank the panelists and Judy in particular for reaching out to folks and bringing it together with such short notice, especially as people's terms are just beginning, and it's a busy time for everyone. And for those of you in Mountain and Central Time happening over the dinner hour to be here, I really appreciate all of you. And I hope to follow up on Dan's comment that I hope we do engage in this more often, because there's a lot of thoughtful people, and we're better together than we are alone. Maybe this is really our starting to do democracy after our group project after January 6th. So thank you all, and we'll make sure to post this so that you and others have access to it after we're done recording live.
Thank you, everyone, for joining. Thanks to Chris and Andrew for helping with the chat, of SS chat.
Thanks to you.
Thanks, everyone.
And thank you to you. Thanks to you, Corey. Have a great night.